Just a reminder again, we're going through till 12 today, and we are currently looking at potentially Monday afternoon if we do need to re-adjourn, or Tuesday. So actually we can have that conversation offline as well, just to check in on everyone's availability. But bearing in mind we do have some very tight timeframes around the long-term plan, which this needs to feed into. So our finance team is very keen to move as quickly as we can with this. Right, so next on our list we have the charge around those properties that are close to a connection to our city water and sewerage supplies, number 10, which the proposal currently is that they would pay 70% of those targeted rates, and the existing policy is actually 50%. Now this was actually something that I put on the list, and I guess I was wanting to discuss everyone's views on leaving it at the current policy 50% rate.
I agree.
Councillor Simpson?
Through you, Madam Chair, I don't have an issue, provided the quality of service at the end of the pipe is suitable for what we're offering. There are some terminations of end of our services that there aren't suitable quantity. So if we look at water pipes, when we get to the end of our network, and there's actually some urban areas that suffer the same, low water pressure or no water pressure at the end of their service, so that the risk here is you might be within that 50 metres or 100 metres, and we might be charging them, but if we actually connected them, we wouldn't be able to provide them a service anyway.
So are you suggesting that we actually review the current 50% in the policy?
I think we just need to make sure that if we are going to charge people for not connecting but being within range, that we would have actually been able to provide them a service.
Bearing in mind that you yourself have just acknowledged that there's some urban areas that are faced with that challenge as well.
But they are connected and they don't have to put their own supply in.
Mm. Do we have any other views? Councillor Brown.
It's my understanding that the 70% came from doing the maths around what it actually costs for the service. So I think I'm prepared to stick with the 70%. I did quite like Paul Harris's submission where there was some incentive if you were going to provide your own water source in a sustainable way and therefore not be a burden on the city's water take, whether there could be some incentive around that.
And I guess that was part of my motivation for raising this, because having it at the lower amount is, to me, an incentive for those people that have the ability to connect but have potentially chosen not to.
It possibly would be too convoluted, but I was thinking at the 70%, but if you're proven that you've got your own water supply, that you could apply for a remission for it to be lower.
Any support for that suggestion around the table?
Yeah, I sort of like the 70%, but I also like the incentive that could be that if they do or are able to provide that information and proof of it, then the remission it could then be reduced to the 50%. So keep it at the 70, but then should the incentive is that we can reduce it to 50% if you can prove that you are doing those environmental or providing those own services.
Which all of them actually are, because they're not connected to the town supply.
Yeah.
Well, I think...
Deputy Mayor Brosnan?
Yeah, I was just going to make the point there's sort of environmentally friendly water supply options, which I think Paul's submission was speaking about, where, say, rainwater was collected, and then there's the type of take like bore water, which is just as sustainable / unsustainable as city supply is from groundwater sources. So I suppose the incentive would be for sustainable, i.e. rainwater collection, potentially.
Yeah, Councillor McGrath.
Through the chair, what's the purpose of charging anything at all?
the cost of actually that infrastructure being there and being able to be connected to if they chose to.
Running past.
Because my concern is if, and I'll use maybe Te Awa, and the example may not even exist. If you've got an old home there and then a subdivision happens around you and the pipe then goes past your house, yet you're on bore water and you've just had the bore renewed and it's good for another 30 years, why would you want to be paying twice? What's its purpose? Is it to encourage people to hurry up and build and get on with it?
No, I think it is, as I said, purely a reflection of the fact that there has been costs incurred for that infrastructure to be outside in close proximity to their property, and they do have the ability to connect, so it's recognising those costs. Councillor Wright.
I used to be in this situation, so I had my own bore on my property in the middle of town and paid 50% because I could connect for years. So really, to me, it comes down to what are you trying to achieve with this fee? Are you trying to encourage people to not have their own bores in the centre of town? Or are you trying to encourage people to have alternative sources of water to take pressure off our system? So to me, it's what are you trying to achieve? And if you really think that people in town shouldn't be on a bore, because again, it's unmonitored water, the bores are often shallow, they drop in some, we suffered low pressure in summer and things like that, then you really want to incentivise them to connect. So by raising that amount to 70%, you're saying to them, well, the water's right past there, you know, we want you to connect. But if that's not the reason for doing it, then just keep it at 50%.
It's interesting.
John.
Through you, Madam Mayor. It's a pretty standard practice for anyone that is able to connect to a water supply network to pay at least 50% across New Zealand. So we're in keeping with practice across New Zealand in that regard. And that's on the basis that as an individual property owner, they may be choosing not to connect, but the resale value of that property enables connection very, very easily. It's pretty straightforward. The other thing that I would remind you about is that with the new drinking water standards coming out, there may be more emphasis on those people with private bores, particularly where they might provide water across their own boundary to other properties. Those sorts of water suppliers will be required to produce water safety plans and comply with the drinking water standards, and that may result in a change in attitude with regard to their own water bores. And yes, they may have only just renewed it, but the standards are changing for everybody.
Thank you, John. That was very useful.
Madam Chair, if I can just seek clarification too, does this also apply for someone who owns two neighbouring properties? One is developed and one they've kept vacant. Is this where that charge comes in? So that if they've got a vacant piece of land next to the land that they are living on, I know there's some tie-up around rates and stuff, but do they get charged that fee for not having developed that second property and connecting it to services?
Through you, Madam Mayor, my understanding is all about the ability to connect and the ease of the ability to connect, because the service is at the gate. Yep. So it is a service section, whether they use the water or not.
And just through the Mayor, so that's also recognising that they will be on different titles as well in a separately identified property.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I think my initial thinking around this was very similar to Deputy Mayor Brosnan's, with the remission being available to those who were having the more sustainable options like rainwater rather than the bores, for the points that Tanya's realised as well. And it also wouldn't be available to those who have undeveloped land because, again, it's the ability to connect.
Councillor Bogue, then Councillor McGrath.
Just to ask the officers through you, Madam Mayor, do we have any policy that might cover this sort of proposed remission? No.
Through you, Madam Mayor, not at present, no.
It would need to be added into the remission policy. Councillor McGrath?
You know, I was just thinking to myself that we charge 100. You know, we seem to be looking at the figure we've currently got and looked whether we're going up or not. But for me, the question is why we're not charging 100%, because we charge households 100% of roads, yet they may not have any cars or licences in that household, but we still charge 100%. So, I don't know, my thinking is why we're not charging 100%.
Anybody wish to comment or discuss that proposition? Councillor Wright?
If we think about the changes that are coming down the pipeline with possible water drinking standards and those rules being applied to people, to possible metering of water and charges for overuse of water and things like that, that's going to take care of all of this stuff. So to me it makes sense just to leave it at the 50% because the legislation and changes coming down the pipeline are just going to fix everything and level the playing field, frankly.
Councillor Crystal?
I totally agree with what Councillor Wright just said. I think at 50% they are paying a charge, and I think we could really complicate things by bringing in remissions and things like that, where with the way the government is going, we kind of really don't know what's going to happen in the space in the near future. So I'm happy to leave it at 50.
Anyone hold a different view to that?
I'd just like to make the comment that the changes in legislation and the things that people are talking about coming down the pipeline, rainwater, and John may correct me, but if people collect rainwater, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to come under the control of the new water regulator, because if am I correct in they're self-supplying?
Yes, it does. It does.
I'll have a go at this through you, Madam Mayor. Those that are purely on a rainwater supply will not be in an area where we have a publicly provided water supply. And they require some pretty large tanks to be able to provide themselves with what is technically a sanitary supply or a sanitary building. Where that rainwater supply and those tanks provide for one house, then they won't have a whole lot of onus on them to develop water safety plans or what have you. But if that supply provides two houses, then absolutely they will. I'd also just note that where within our urban boundaries connected to our water supply, houses may collect rainwater. That may be a 1,000 or 2,000 litre tank. In summers like this, it may only get used once because there's simply not enough rain to refill it again. So those are, just differentiate between a primary supply and a secondary sustainability supply.
Thank you, John. So I'm in support of leaving it at 50%. I would just like to perhaps change the wording a little bit, that rather than changes to legislation may fix this, that due to the upcoming changes in legislation, we would prefer to retain the existing policy percentage. Okay. Are we happy to move on? Great. Next up, we have the remission for land under development.
And through the Mayor, so it is normal practice for authorities to charge for land under development. wanted to make councillors aware, where you've got a number of properties that may be being developed, until such time as they are under separate title, will they be separately rated for? So, for example, if one developer bought enough for 10 sections, they would only be paying one rate until such time the Section 224 certificate has been issued, and at which point they'll be under separate titles and then paying those rates. There are other mechanisms that council could consider if they wish to under remissions as to whether or not they consider further any options for developers. However, it does beg the questions of such things as when, for example, may farmland become bare land? When does bare land cease to become bare land? When do other property types become bare land? So it does start to unravel itself as to then how you might categorise development and whether or not they were suitable for remission. So the existing remission applies for SUPs where we only pay one SUP, where multiple parcels are owned by the same developer, which I've mentioned. There is a further option about looking to postpone and looking at the postponement policy. However, that also brings into question things like when would the development be completed? So how long would you be postponing rates for? And if the development wasn't completed, whether or not those rates would become payable at all. So there's still obviously some things to work through with that, but the recommendation is with development, it is normal practice for charges to be made, and they only become multiple titles, at which point where the 224C is issued.
So one of my thoughts with this is that I didn't realise that we were already not charging rates until a title had been issued. The submitter that presented this to us, I got the impression that there was already rates being charged on land developments that didn't have a title issued. So it was good to get that clarification. So I guess just opening up for if there is any desire for us to recognise, because the other point that was made is that these empty sections are being charged a general rate for the ratepayers to access community common good facilities, but of course there's no ratepayers living on that property because there's no dwelling on it as yet. So putting it on the table for discussion. Councillor Brown.
My understanding of the submission was that once there was plans put together for development, the value of his property skyrocketed and therefore his rates skyrocketed with it. So the request, as I understood it, was to have a hold. So you put your plans into council if they are, and they're approved, say, the rates are held at the current value of the property and you have X number of years to be able to do your development before your rates are increased to the current value of your property. So it was an incentive to develop.
Yes, that was further detail around the submission. Councillor Simpson?
Yeah, if I can just seek clarification. So just on the, was it 442 title declaration, 224? So as soon as that title is declared, then each of those individual properties become separately rated. I think what the submitter was looking at was whether the rates would apply once the code of compliance on the dwellings were issued. As just to try to create a new line in the sand as far as when residency may be taken up. So the question is, how would that work? Because if council would have already committed, I suggest in some cases, not in this particular case, because I know this particular developer put all of the infrastructure into that development, and will at some point in time, we will inherit that investment. So he's had to do that investment at council standards before council will ever, before he receives any return on that investment. So I think he was looking at where that line in the sand is. And because the problem with the development would be how long after title are the property sold, plans submitted, codes of compliance installed. So that could take a number of years. We know the Building Act, once you've submitted it for construction, you've got about 2 years, I think it is, to complete the construction to get your code of compliance. But it's a case of how long is that piece of string and what's actually tenable from a council perspective. And it's whether council has made considerable outlay in support beforehand. But I think in this case, the developer's had all of the outlay and is then paying increased rates before he's able to sell or have other people build on the properties. So I think he's trying to figure out, well, where could that line in the sand be? Because, you know, in some cases getting finance is an issue, and he's carrying all that finance risk and burden, and we're then imposing further financial penalties on him for having done that work for us to increase our rates base. And I think his point is fair, but it's a case of how long is that piece of string.
Gary.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I do recall that submission quite well. I had a detailed conversation with Mr. Ellis, and he posed a very good problem. So essentially for him, the issue has arisen due to the timing of the revaluation. So where previously he had farmland, it was valued as farmland, it's been revalued as residential property. And so that's where he's seen a significant increase in the value of his property. Hence that flows through to the rates. Done a lot of thinking about the remissions and potential postponements, and that's why those three questions were posed, because it's something that would need some serious consideration. But something which may be a simpler fix due to this situation is around the phasing. The phasing would reduce the impact, but also provide incentive to get the rest of the development completed, because they wouldn't immediately take on the full rate applicable for a residential property. So that may actually be a suitable fix.
So the proposal around potentially phasing the introduction of these changes across 3 years would also assist with this particular situation. Councillor Brown.
Would that apply for future developments?
Well, sorry, through you, Madam Mayor. Again, where we see the timing of a development around a revaluation, we're always going to see that issue. And so I think in this situation, with that one particular development, this may be a suitable fix, but it is something that we could look at in the future, but would need a bit of research and discussion and consultation on it. It's not something we could address and answer straight away. It's a more complex question that needs to be unpicked.
Councillor Cran.
Yeah, I just... I absolutely acknowledge that it's complex and that the phasing would seem to offer us a solution for now. But I think one of the overarching views that we're taking at the moment and that we're trying to set is that it's not just about now, you know, that long-term view. So I think it would be worth us investigating that further. We are suffering from a massive, massive housing shortage in our city. So anything that we can do to incentivise developers to undertake projects like this, especially if they're going to front up and put in the infrastructure themselves, which will be vested back to us, I think we need to seriously consider what tools we have available to make that sort of stuff happen.
Thank you. Councillor Mawson.
Through the Chair, infrastructure aside, would this also be appropriate to apply this to, say, a person that just wants to subdivide and stick another dwelling on them? I mean, we've been using the word developer, so I'm just looking at the total scheme of things here. I appreciate in the instance that Councillor Simpson was talking about, where the submitter was generally talking about how his land had changed to residential and thus became more expensive, but I'm just sort of thinking of a complete look at the whole thing. And obviously, if I were to subdivide my property, would these incentives help me?
So I'm thinking that there's some complexities to this that need to be worked through, and I would like to flag that perhaps this is something that we put to consider in the future, in a future review, which is likely to occur in the not too distant future, which we'll touch on in a little bit when we talk about capital value versus land value. So we do have opportunities to actually do some further research on this for consideration in the future. Is everybody happy with that approach? Yep. Great. You don't need any more words around that, our governance team?
So can you just note that as an action, please, Helen, rather than we need to put an approach? So the action down the bottom is that this be considered in a future policy review.
Madam Mayor.
Councillor Brown?
Can I just ask a question around the existing remission for increases over 25%? Would that apply in this situation?
Through you, Madam Mayor. Absolutely. It would apply, but if there was a consideration for phasing citywide, then it would certainly fit within that as well.
Oh, sorry, on a one-off basis. So say that at another time a developer had rural land that was then classified as residential because it was planning to be developed, therefore the rates on that property went up. Would it, and if they went up by over 25%, would that remission kick in, or would it be not valid because I'm guessing it would be one ratepayer going to multiple ratepayers?
Sorry, through you, Madam Mayor. That's a really good question. The policy that particular part of the remission policy relates to impact of policy changes. So it doesn't account for economic change, which we should try to avoid as well. Yeah. So in that situation, if it was purely outside of this review, then the answer is no, the remission wouldn't apply.
Okay.
Right. Our next topic is current provisions for small businesses operating from a dwelling.
And through the Mayor, so this one is obviously, again, quite a complex issue. And really it comes down to how would council officers, for example, identify where a business is being run from home, and then what is the impact that it does have on the city for running those services from home. The recommendation from council officers is that we consider this as part of a district plan review, which identifies what activities can be undertaken in the city and what areas and for what reason. And then with having this definition, then we're able to apply that through our rating system, as opposed to then looking at the rates and how we might address that. I think it's better to do it from the district plan as to what activities are allowed, and then we can develop up the rating that would then follow suit.
And I guess just to provide a little bit more background as to how this came through in the consultation is we have some small business owners operating from their dwellings who have complied with council regulations around ensuring that they actually have applied for a code of compliance, etc., and essentially declared that they're operating from home and as such are charged additional rates, whereas they may not actually be placing a significant additional burden on the infrastructure because of that business operating from their home. And then, of course, there's the small businesses that are not being compliant and with regulations and declaring that they're working from home. So just to provide a little bit of context around the submissions that we've received and just put this on the table for discussion. Councillor McGrath.
Yeah. What about houses that have been converted to solely business? How will they be rated if we're aware of it? Will they flick into commercial if no one's living on the property and it's solely a business?
Gary, are you able to comment on that?
I can. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
I'm trying not to name any, but some of the dental practices around maybe or...
It's a challenge we constantly face. based on the dynamic nature of property use throughout the city. At the moment, often it's through the consenting processes where we pick up the change of usage and we rate accordingly. It's also through physical inspection. And so there are a number of businesses such as hairdressers, that kind of thing, that can operate without consent, where they do tend to slip under the radar. Something I might add, though, is that typically those businesses that haven't registered don't receive the same level of protection in terms of insurance and those sorts of things if something does go wrong. So although, you know, in some of these situations people have done the right thing and they feel like they've been punished by doing that, in a recent situation such as the flood, they'd have business insurance and other things that would be available to them that these other parties wouldn't have as a result of not properly registering their business.
But you've answered my question by the first part of your answer, so that's great. Covered.
Councillor Simpson.
Through Madam Chair, and perhaps Councillor Brosner would be more aware of this than I. The district plan, that picks up matters of nuisance or consumption around activities associated with properties, so that if you're operating, say, in a home environment, if you're generating more traffic than a normal household would, or you're requiring more street frontage car parking because of the service you're providing, or if you're using water or sewer more than a standard dwelling, then that's where the district plan comes in? I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. So through the district plan, it sets a permitted level of activity along with residential. For instance, daycare, home-based carers have a certain number of children, etc., that they're allowed to have before it ticks over into needing resource consent, and for the likes of any other business as well. Traffic considerations are part of that, along with use of services, and so that's what's up for discussion as we set our district plan around what those permitted levels are.
Councillor Crystal and then Councillor Bogue.
One of the things, obviously, I know the case that's submitted, and they're paying basically two sets of rates and for two sets of rubbish bins and recycling, which they don't get. So that ability to apply for a remission for those services is going to happen, isn't it? Or is it? Yeah.
That's something that needs to be agreed on.
Yeah. Okay, because that was something that we talked about as well, that they're having to pay twice for a set of things that they don't use as well.
Councillor Bogue.
I understand many of the home businesses also would be subject to different regulations if they're providing food or providing different kinds of services, which the council interacts with them on those bases.
Through you, Madam Mayor, that's correct. So where there's some sort of consent involved, that's where we can flag those businesses. So in terms of food preparation, absolutely, there need to be consents or certain medical services. But again, hairdressing isn't covered under that. So they can just open and operate from their home.
They had to have an inspection.
So the recommendation in front of us is that this should be considered as a district plan issue, and then following that we could look at it in a future review of the rates and finance policy. In the meantime, nothing changes for that group of ratepayers.
Through the Mayor, as Gary mentioned before, it's picked up through the consenting process for any change in the use of the property, or we undertake reviews on an ongoing basis as to what's actually happening in the city and make sure we've got rateable properties identified on an ongoing basis.
That assessment would be visual. We'd basically be driving around the streets looking for signs on the fence.
That's correct.
I'm happy to leave it.
Is that how she...
Councillor Brown?
I'm trying to find it on the district plan and I can't quite find the rules. I know in Hastings, if you've got a home occupation that's permitted, it can only take up less than 5% of your property. Is that similar to New Zealand? To Napier?
Yeah, through you, Madam Mayor, I don't have the answer to that, but we don't, it wouldn't be anything like 5%, I don't imagine. But something we do look at when it comes to some of these businesses, again, is that predominant use thing. So if we see that it's really just a garage that's being used rather than the whole house, and it's a small activity, then we may look at it as residential. There needs to be, that there are so many properties within that grey area that we need to look at it on a case-by-case basis and be reasonable in our assessment.
Are there any further comments? Okay, so we've got okay, that looks good. So essentially the decision has been to consider this as part of the district plan review and then look at it in a future review of the revenue and finance policy. We'll leave the UAGC till the end. So one of our questions yesterday was we were wanting a little bit more background information about the Bayview water meters. So I'd like to invite John to provide us with some information around that.
Sorry, I don't know if this matters at all, Your Worship, but current provisions for compliance.
Yeah, I think if we just leave it as that more generic term at the moment, yeah.
Through you, Madam Mayor. So the Bayview water scheme has quite a history, and you've got to go back to its origins in terms of it was once supplied from water in the Esk River. However, the water quality from that supply degraded quite significantly, so changes were required. A new bore and pipeline was installed from Tannery Road to Bayview to augment that supply, and essentially the costs associated with that were ring-fenced and charged to Bayview community. In recognition that some properties, either through size or land use or some other third category that does not spring to mind. But because some users used a lot more water than others, water meters were installed, and those high users who use more than 300 cubic metres a year paid more. So that's why there are water meters, and that's why they have a different charging regime to the rest of Napier.
Councillor Brown.
If that initial investment was ring-fenced, I'm guessing it was loan funded. What's the balance on that loan?
Pass. This is we've looked into this last night and this morning, so haven't had the time to pull that sort of information out. Adele, I think the income we get from that.
Through the mayor, depending on the year and volumes used, between $35,000 and $57,000 in the last 3 years.
That's the income.
Total income. Yes.
And do we know whether there's still a debt to be repaid on the original investment, or is that contributing to operating costs now?
It's currently contributing to operating costs.
How's that fair?
It's
not fair.
Sorry,
Councillor Crystal.
So just how's that fair then? Because if they've paid for them now and we're wanting them to be part of our general rate, they're paying more. And there's also a group of Taradale residents under that water meter system too.
That's the new development.
But also some of the old ones in Oak Road up there. And the old...
Do we not? Yeah, do we have a list of exactly what parts of the community are metered currently?
Here he is.
Here he is, he heard.
And would it be, and again, you may not have had the opportunity to look into this, but would it be for similar reasons that they're metered, because it was to pay for investment that had been made in infrastructure in those areas?
Sorry, I missed that.
Just the other areas that we do have meters in place, would it be, and again, you may not know the answer to this right at this point, John, but it would be likely for similar reasons because of investment that's been made in infrastructure specifically for those communities?
I'd have to look into that, Madam Mayor, but I know that we do have some high water users with large properties that do have water meters, and that may be for pools or irrigating large sections or what have you. So, yeah, without having done more research, I can't really answer that more definitively.
Your Worship, just a couple of comments.
Yep.
The rest home pays for excess above the 300. And another example of infrastructure development where a community pays is parking in Taradale, where they decided to have parking meters, and how was that going to be paid for? And so there are parking meters in the Taradale community, so it's a similar scenario.
Who made the choice on the parking meters though? Were the residents said, hey,
Yes.
do you want to keep your water meters? Wondering how we came to be taking some money, positive money off it.
In both cases, the community was consulted with.
I'll have to find that.
So I'd like to propose that this again is something that we tag for looking at in our next review, by which time we could have done some more research and have further information to inform any decision making around this. Councillor Brown?
I'd like to suggest that one of the things we investigate in that review is if that funding was originally ring-fenced for the investment plus the operating costs, we look into, and the investment costs are already paid off, we look at what the operating costs and renewals would be and look at potentially decreasing the amount, the base amount, to whatever that new ring fence cost would be for operating costs.
Councillor Wright.
Would that be slightly dangerous in that the costs could actually go up?
Through you, Madam Mayor, there's always a risk.
Yeah, and consider adjusting the amount charged accordingly as opposed to decreasing in the wording.
Only talking.
I think we should just get rid of reading the water meters and charge them their normal fee like everyone else, and the smoothing happens across the city like it does for every other ratepayer.
Are you suggesting that for all areas that are metered when we don't actually have a good understanding of why they're metered at the moment?
Yep.
Sorry, what are you suggesting?
Residential, yes. I think it should be smoothed across the city. We're not charging Tamatea extra because they're getting a change in system with the dirty water issues we've had. Everyone should be paying the same for water supply to their gate.
To residential property?
To residential properties.
Yeah.
I agree.
We may all be required to put in meters as part of Title way. So if we look at the 3-year option,
Happy.
I expect that Title might provide good clarity around what's expected nationally.
So in line with our earlier decision around not changing the percentage around being close or having the ability to connect, one option to consider is that again this is laid on the table, so we see what the legislative changes come through and how they may impact on this with regards to the potential introduction of meters across the board for residential ratepayers.
I'd actually be happy to stop charging the residential people until that decision's made.
Mm-hmm.
We either charge everyone in Napier or no one. If that debt's been paid back, I'm not sure why their residential sections are still paying.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I have an understanding that the charges of these properties are actually less than everyone else?
No.
Is it the same? So they still get the same, charge the same amount of water for water, but if they
For
do
city
over and
water,
above-
they do get charged the same
Okay.
fixed fee of $236.
You know, if it's the same, I'd propose that we even it up.
Councillor Crystal.
A lot of the submitters said to us, if you're going to do these changes, then give us the same as town, and this is the same as town. We heard that so many times. So, yeah, I can't see the reasoning behind it either, because it's not all, it's only the places that have water. Obviously, there's a huge majority of these submitters that haven't, so it doesn't affect them, but there is those people that have.
Councillor Wright.
We've had a bit of an explanation about Bayview, but until I understand why we're doing it in other places, I'm not happy to make a decision about it. I want to have the information in front of me of who's being metered for water or charged a different fee for water and why, before I'm prepared to remove that charge or consider doing something different.
Councillor Mawson.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also one aspect we've not looked at is the environmental aspect, that putting money aside, potentially we could actually have Bayview residents change their behaviours towards water, and they may actually use more water, which puts a lot more pressure. I mean, they're looking at water meters across the board, and potentially one of the reasons why, say, the water regulator would put them in would be from a conservation perspective and conserving water, rather than charging. So that would be my only issue with changing it, so that they didn't pay. They've developed these behaviours. They understand that there's a potentially a consequence for paying a little bit more. I think that probably if we leave it on the table at the moment, and then obviously through what Councillor Tapani said, chances are in a year it's probably going to change anyway.
It's the same.
I've just had John indicate he'd like to talk.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would support that kororo, particularly with regard to our resource consent that has conditions of consent that require us to implement demand management measures to ensure that our water use across the Napier is efficient. So while I appreciate that some of our measures aren't being applied consistently, I would suggest that to remove that volumetric charging for high water users would be a step backwards in that regard, and might not be seen favourably by our consenting authorities.
If I go from what Councillor Mawson said, if they already have a learnt behaviour, it's not likely to change.
Disagree.
Okay, and why are we only picking on one group?
Is that sorry, through you, Madam Mayor, is that a suggestion that we water meter everybody?
Yep. No.
Thank you for the clarification.
Deputy Mayor Brosnan.
I support line the conversation on the table until we can get a bit more clarity, like what Tanya has suggested. I think that's reasonable. I don't take everything John said at 100%, because I know consent conditions well, and I think we have the opportunity to use demand management in a consistent way across the city, not inconsistently as we are currently, but I absolutely take the point that we don't want to have a perverse outcome in removing the volumetric charging. So, yeah, happy to have the conversation again once we understand what Councillor Wright has suggested and yourself.
So, in light of the potential changes to legislation and future requirement for water meters across the board, and the fact that we would like more information around those areas that are currently being metered, the proposal is to lay this on the table and consider under the next review.
Excuse me, through you, Madam Mayor, is it worthwhile putting CEF a requirement by the government or regulator rather than a requirement, because that's kind of pointing in our direction, whereas clearly we've indicated that we don't want water meters and that it's potentially something that the government might choose for us.
Yeah, we don't know if they're going to choose it
Sorry,
or not.
Helen,
So
but
yeah,
just
exactly.
on line
Yeah.
one, under requirement. So just note that in line one for the requirement, the the central government requirement and the changes with the water regulator.
You get dirty. Excuse me, just to go on a little bit of a tangent while that's being done. Has Bayview had any dirty water issues where we encourage them, if they do, to flush their line for 20 minutes?
Through you, Madam Mayor, not to my knowledge, but they have had a number of contamination events in the recent past.
And would we encourage them to flush their lines and use excess water in those situations?
As we do elsewhere, if there is dirty water. Yep.
Yep. So, are we responsible for those outbreaks, for a better term? Is it our responsibility to sort them or prevent them?
As a public water supplier who provides that network, absolutely.
Yeah. Yet, if these people flush their lines and go over their limits, they're getting charged for it. All right.
Yes, and in my experience elsewhere, where that supply is metered, then that is a quantifiable overuse, and in other areas there is an ability to seek remissions on that sort of use for that purpose. So there are other opportunities that those meters provide for in that regard.
Okay. Happy with that wording. So we do have the next...
Sorry, just through the Mayor, it's 35 to 57.
Oh, 35 to 57.
My bad, I apologise.
Thank you.
Clarification, is it 35 to 57 above the normal take? Above the base?
Yes, so that's the income generated as a result of the excess consumption above 300 cubic metres.
All right, next up we just have a little bit more information about why we chose to do this review now, as a number of submitters were questioning the need to do it now, and also around why status quo had not been included in consultation as an option. So this is just sort of a bit of an information sharing topic.
And through the Mayor, so as we've noted in the consultation document that went out to the community, a first principles review hadn't been undertaken since 1998, although we had been reviewing the policy between 1998 and now. But the first principles requirement actually starts looking at it from the from a zero position, if you like, as opposed to utilising or reviewing what you had in place. And that's quite different than actually taking those existing assumptions and building on them, which is what we had been using in the past. So for that reason, to set at the first principles, and we've done a number of 14 workshops to get there, means that the status quo actually isn't an option, because you're actually starting everything from afresh, unless all your assumptions that when you rebuilt them ended back up in your status quo scenario, and which, as you found through that process, we actually didn't land in that position. And I think if you'll sort of reflect on where we've come through, you'll see that some of the differences have come through from the community during that time, and that's why we went back to that first principle to see whether or not we were consistently applying the methodologies that are fit for the purpose with our current community. So we're actually required under the Local Government Act to do a first principles review. It's under section 101, 102 and 103. And so that's what we've undertaken as part of this process.
Does anyone have any questions with regards to this? Councillor Bogue.
Was 1998 the last time we did this?
We've undertaken the reviews in between time. You'll note that we've had a number of consultations with the community on our revenue and financing policy with minor changes, but the first principle review hasn't been undertaken since the 98 review.
And is there a requirement that it's done every so often, or how many years?
The policy should be reviewed every 3 years, in which we have been doing. The recommendation is to do a first principles review on a periodic basis, but this is the first time that we've undertaken it, and we're looking us to do that full review.
Thank you.
Sorry, Dale. The recommendation? I thought earlier you expressed that this was in the Act, the principles approach.
The Act governs how you would go about a first principles review.
Councillor Brown.
Just a point of clarification. I think it was 89. Was it 98?
98.
Okay.
What numbers?
Right. Next up, we...
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
2001, sorry, and that was so there was two reviews, one in 98 and one in 2001, and the first principles review under the legislation was 2001, and then the legislation changed after that.
Okay. So next up we have around separating out the general rate, and some, just again, this is probably more some commentary about what will happen in the future, and it won't impact on our deliberations as such.
And through the Mayor, so the general rate, as we've talked about quite a bit during the deliberations, effectively does come through UAGCs. However, as we've noted, we've got under the Rating Act, we can only go up to a maximum of 30% on those fixed charges. However, what we're recommending now is we provide more detail to the community around what those fixed charges that the community are paying for, what they might be, and we can cover that through their rating bill as well, and provide that sort of increased level of transparency around those community-wide activities.
So again, in line with our conversation about there wanting to be more transparency as to what the general rate covers, and providing that information on rates, notices, etc. If there's no questions, we'll move on. And next one we have which we touched on earlier. So again, just to recap on it, was around the remission for SNAs, which we discussed earlier, that we were actually going to provide some further clarification in the remissions policy for that. I don't know that we need to discuss that any further. Now, next up, we had a number of submitters that were comparing our rating policy to Hastings. So staff have just pulled together some comments with regards to that.
Okay, thank you. So something that is a little bit unique to Napier, which a lot of other councils don't experience, is that apart from the seaward side of the Napier boundary, we're effectively enveloped by Hastings. And so what that means is that there's a portion of the Hastings community as such, or Hastings ratepayers, that actually use and utilise the Napier network. And so, for instance, you're looking at those areas in Priority and Bayview, sorry, not Bayview, but sort of Eskdale, that although they may pay rates to Hastings, are more likely to, say, do their shopping and use a roading network and the libraries and other services within Napier. So as a result of that unusual arrangement, or the geographic shape of their boundaries, the Hastings Council have recognised that, or acknowledged that, through another differential that allows for those sort of outlying properties. And so there were several comments made by submitters over the last few days, as well as through the written submission, saying, well, my neighbours across the road pay X, it's unfair. But what Hastings has tried to acknowledge is that, yes, they may pay money to the Hastings Council, but they're effectively using the Napier network. So there is quite a distinction there. And so their neighbours who are part of Napier would effectively be using, well, primarily using the Napier network, which is why they're paying our rates. As a personal example as well, when I started at council, I was half an hour out of town on the Napier Taupo Road. I'd drive into Bayview, park my car, ride along the beach into town, and I'd be working here, so using the cycleways and the roads here. I'd do my shopping here, I'd socialise here, use the libraries here and everything else before heading home, but I was still paying all my rates to Hastings. And so it's just to acknowledge that boundary and the likely usage of those residents in those areas.
And just through the Mayor, I'd also just like to add so that the more technical aspects of our rate setting needs to be done individually by each council. So the policy under which we are setting our rates is determined, as we've been through the process at the moment, through a process by first principles. And so when we're looking at comparing rates between Napier and Hastings, it all really comes down to that policy setting, which may be quite different in each aspect of those two communities. And so we have to acknowledge that we are required under our own legislation to come up with our own policy, which may in fact then drive some differences between the communities. And unfortunately, that's how we're required to undertake our activities and prepare our policy under the Act.
Councillor Wright.
These kinds of situations that you've outlined, to me, reiterate the necessity for us to review our boundaries around our city, because you've just identified a large group of people who are living near our city and using our city services, but who are not paying rates to our city, and to me that's unacceptable. We're obviously their community. They obviously see themselves as part of our community and use our services, yet they have to pay effectively a tax for services to another city that they do not identify with, and this should not continue. So I hope that we will continue with the idea of exploring those boundary changes in the future, because the only other thing I could see is we could ask Hastings to collect a little bit of rates from them to give to us for all the services that we provide.
Councillor Taylor.
Yeah, like Gary, I personally was involved in that scenario when living in Hedgley Road, and so I paid rates to Hastings, dog fees to Hastings, and I identified with Napier. I did not receive any waste collection or any other services. So I was quite happy that I wasn't paying the same as people in Hill Road who were receiving those. And during the submissions where we talked about Rotowhenua Road, the circumstances have changed there since we introduced wheelie bins, because those on one side of the road who were in the Hastings district were actually taking their black rubbish bags and putting them on the Napier side because Napier was collecting that rubbish for them. The introduction of wheelie bins has now meant that the Hastings residents who don't have them are not getting their waste removed and have had to now engage with independent contractors to pick up their general waste. So I concur completely with Councillor Wright that we need to look very carefully at those on the fringe, because those people don't identify with Hastings, they identify with Napier, they use Napier facilities. I never drove over to go to the swimming pool in Hastings, I never went to the Hastings library. The only time I did have to go over there was when my dog went missing and it was impounded in Flaxmere. So that was the only, and I had paid my fees to the Hastings Council.
Councillor Bogue.
Looking at it another way, there are some municipalities, some towns that provide incentives in terms of use of their facilities for ratepayers, because I've been asked several times, we should pay less for the aquarium and less for the pools and all that sort of thing. So, I mean, that's another possibility. It's a whole different story, of course, but some cities do that. If you're a ratepayer or a resident in a particular city, you pay less, and if you're not, you pay more for council-based facilities. So maybe at some stage it might be worth us looking at that and seeing if it's financially feasible.
Thank you, Councillor Bogue, and just commenting that we do have, for example, Friends of the Aquarium, which are available to locals to get a reduced rate to go to the aquarium during the year. But a wider review of that could certainly be undertaken at some stage in the future. So I think there's probably two actions really that come from this, and that is firstly around the city boundaries and the fact that should remain on our radar going forward. And then, as Councillor Bogue has highlighted, the potential for local rates at council-owned facilities. Or local, fees and charges might be clearer. Now, I'm conscious we've only got a few minutes left, and I really want us to provide some direction to council officers on the UAGC so that they can actually, because that really is the final lever that we have for the modelling to be undertaken. We had discussed yesterday the looking at how increasing the UAGC to 22% would affect the overall outcome. So opening that up for discussion, Councillor Crown.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I was quite keen for us to investigate dropping the rural residential differential to the 90% to see if that smoothed to the point where we wouldn't need to change the UAGC. So I'm really interested in actually seeing the modelling on both those, considering the UAGC to a 22% and the dropping of that differential as well.
Okay, so two scenarios. One whereby the rural residential is at 92.5% and the UAGC is increased to 22%. And the second scenario where the rural residential is 90% and no change to the UAGC.
Sorry,
92.
just through the mirror as well, you've also noted that you've got the change in commercial as well, so you've got that overlay.
Yes, and both those scenarios So I'll just give some numbers for our governance team. So the first scenario is...
Oh, could we please bring the screen up? Okay.
Oh, no, sorry. Back to the other one.
Oh, sorry.
So the first scenario is rural residential at 92.5% and UAGC at 22. Then second scenario as the rural residential at 90% and UAGC at 20%. Commercial to be 260% in both scenarios.
And just to clarify, we are looking at spreading it over the
phasing over 3 years.
3 years, yeah.
And just through the me, just noting that the stormwater would be implemented from in full in year one, and that any of the activity changes into our splits, with our percentages that we've agreed, they would also be effective from the first day of year one.
Councillor Simpson.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'd actually like us to explore. A number of our submitters spoke to the UAGC as being a tool. I'm just wondering whether the 2% change is enough to demonstrate the impact of such modelling.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder whether we should perhaps even look at a UAGC at, say, 25%, just to show how extreme that may become, just so that we've got a clear example as to around the rationale as to why it needs to be at the 22%, because I don't think that change is actually going to be significant enough to actually demonstrate the risk of taking it too far.
And in terms of the rural residential differential in that scenario, are you wanting it for both scenarios with UAGC at 25% or? Yep. So it might be easier to both scenarios with UAGC at 25%. good suggestion, Councillor Simpson. Right, I think that is a good place to stop for today, and I think we've actually worked through this really, really well, so that we've got the direction for council officers to now be able to go and work on that modelling for us to consider when we reconvene on either Monday or Tuesday. So thank you once again, everybody, for your input today, and we will close with our karakia.
Ki tau te rangamare, ki ranga i ngā iwi katoa o Rangiri, kia piki o rā ki kaha, me te maramatanga ngā wā katoa. Te hei, Māori ora.
Thank you.